Hi, and welcome back to Act on Mental Health. My name is Sean Hardy. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Today, I'm at my Crosswinds office location, and I'll be doing this video from here today. Now, on this channel, we're here to learn acceptance and commitment therapy, or as it's known as ACT, and how to improve life mindfully using ACT. This is the third video in our series, ACT for Anxiety. And today, we're going to learn how to tackle anxiety by getting out of the game. And so I'll do that with a metaphor using a football stadium. Now, today's focus is on how labels that we assign ourselves or from our learning history and the thoughts that we cling to and how they can shape our experience and anxiety. So let's get started and I'll get more into the video. If you want to take a moment and hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, feel free to do so. Also, there's free resources that are available to download on my website, seanhardy.com. Labels play a huge role in how we see ourselves. From a young age, we have a learning history that relies on feedback from others in our world. So whether it be our parents, teachers, coaches, or peers, we begin to develop a concept of who we are. And we put these labels on ourselves, either as lazy, hard worker, procrastinator, diligent, smart, stupid, anxious, fearful. There's a lot of labels out there. And in fact, these labels can be true in some instances and not true in other instances. And we can look at the evidence for these, can't we? We look at, in some instances, where I may feel stupid or incompetent, which for me happens quite a bit. And so on some instances, it is true. I don't know enough, or maybe the knowledge isn't coming to me when the test is due. But is that true in all instances? Well, it's really not, because I've had feedback from others that say, wow, that was really insightful, Sean, or that was a really smart thing to say, Sean. And so in some instances, it may be true that I might be incompetent or not know enough, while in others, I may be overconfident. I may be able to know my stuff and tell people without even thinking about it. The problem is when we become too rigid to these self-labels. When we become attached to a label, we are narrow in our perspective and we overlook complexity of who we are. This has to do with the phenomenon of hiding and highlighting. When we have a label such as I'm stupid, we're highlighting a characteristic about ourselves that we don't like. And what happens when you have something that's right here is it tends to hide the other things that are right there. Just like if you took a highlighter pen and you highlighted all the words that are negative on a page, your eyes would be drawn to whatever those negative things are. Now, I want you to do an experiment with me. If you're at home and you have a place you can write down some labels, I want you to think about all those labels that you've heard or you've attached to yourself over time. Now, a visual of this, I had I want to say she was 14 years old and she was dealing with some self-esteem issues. And I had her take sticky notepads and I wrote to write down all the thoughts and feelings that she had about herself or that she had heard about herself. And what ended up happening is she had all these labels and she began to kind of stick them all over her body. And then I held up a little mirror for her to see herself. And that is a good illustration of something that's internal and externalizing it for that person. But you can do this right here. You can start to write down these labels so that you can see all these concepts that you've had about yourself. Now, the problem with labels is that we only see it from those perspectives. And so this exercise is going to help you to get outside of that perspective. So once you have those labels, you have a few things that you've written down, I want you to ask yourself, are these true in all instances? Or are there some instances where it's not true? So I want you to think about different roles that you take, maybe as a parent, maybe as a worker, or as a student, or just a fellow human being. I want you to think about different roles that you take, and I want you to ask yourself, is this true about me all the time? The result of this exercise will probably show you that they're not true all the time, that there's some situations in which you're the complete opposite. You're a complex person. You're unique. And so labels don't capture who you are. If anything, they hide who you are They highlight certain things about you that maybe you'd like to be true, or maybe you don't want to be true, but they also hide a whole lot about you. So when it comes to anxiety, this attachment to labels can become a big problem. So let's take this concept of labels one step further. So we don't just have these labels at some times in our life. No, it's what we do with the labels. We put these in a story. If you recall those children's exercise where they have you put a noun or a verb in different spaces in the story, and then you have fun with it. You read the story with those random nouns and verbs you put in there. Well, that's kind of what it's like with these labels, that it completely changes the story about who we are. So I want you to imagine your label was boring or useless. When someone tells you otherwise, how do you respond? Maybe you reject their compliments or find a way to downplay them. So that's not who I am. No, I'm boring. I'm useless. This is how our attachment to labels keeps us stuck in our stories. Now let's flip it. Even positive labels like I'm a good person can become problematic, because if you cling to being a good person all the time, you might put yourself in situations where you're taken advantage of trying to do too much good and be perceived as kind of obnoxious or goody two-shoe or holier than thou. So even positive labels can become problematic if we're overly attached to them. So the key here is to step back from these labels. You are much more than any label that you can put on yourself, and your story is more dynamic than any label that you put in there, like this noun, this verb. Even though it changes the story and maybe helps you to kind of feel better about yourself, they become problematic because we become too rigid in our behavioral responses because we have to be this label. Our story has to sound like this. By loosening your grip on these labels, you create space for a richer experience of life. And actually it helps you to get out of the game with anxiety and to actually tackle it and to have some success in moving the ball forward. I'm going to show you through this football stadium metaphor about the noticing self and how this helps us to get that space between our labels, our story, and really who we are. Imagine your mind as a football stadium. In this stadium, two teams are playing. One represents your positive thoughts and feelings, and the other represents your negative ones. You can picture the positive thoughts as the offense, trying to push forward and score, while the negative thought team is the defense, blocking progress and pushing back. As the stadium, you're not one of the players. You're not simply the quarterback or the running back or the linebacker. You're simply the space where the game is happening. The thoughts and feelings are the players on the field, and they're locked in a battle, fighting for control. It's the classic us versus them scenario. But the game doesn't end with just the players. There's also referees making calls, representing your judgments about whether things are going right or whether things are going wrong. The coaches on the sidelines could represent the advice or expectations you get from others in your life. The fans in the stands are like all those outside influences. What others think of you, how society tells you to feel. And then there's you, the stadium itself. Now ask yourself, which perspective do I most often take? The players, the coaches, the referees, or the fans? Too often we get caught up in the game, identifying with either the offense or defense, thinking that we have to win. But what if, instead of being a player, a coach, or a referee, you simply observe the game unfolding as the field? This is where we introduce the idea of the noticing self. The noticing self is the part of you that can step back and simply observe your thoughts and feelings as they arise, without taking sides. It's like sitting in the stadium and watching the game unfold. You realize that you don't have to get involved in the back and forth battle between the offense and the defense. You can simply observe. When you step into the noticing self, you begin to see that your thoughts are just players on the field. You don't have to be the quarterback running the plays. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to be the referee constantly judging how things are going. You can just be the stadium, the space where everything happens, but it isn't directly involved in the outcome. Now, if you're willing, I want you to try a brief exercise. I want you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. As you breathe, notice the thoughts that come up, whether they're about anxiety, stress, or something else. Now imagine you're sitting in a football stadium. You can see the players on the field, and each one represents a different thought. Instead of getting caught up in the game, just watch. Notice the game without jumping in to coach, referee, or play. That's the power of the noticing self. And you can do this at any time by slowing down and noticing your thoughts and feelings as they arise. Thank you for joining me today as we explored how labels, the story we tell ourselves, and the noticing self can transform the way that we experience anxiety. Don't forget to visit my website, SeanHardy.com, for free downloadable resources, and subscribe for more content in this series. Remember, your journey towards a more purposeful and mindful life begins with a single click.